You can ask any mechanic. The most complex part in your car is the transmission, and without it, your vehicle will not move and is useless. Most mechanics will refuse to even work on them because they're so complex and it's very easy to make a simple mistake that can cost you hours and labor. So today we're going to talk about what it takes to rebuild a transmission, what tools you need to get the job done, and what makes them so hard and complex to fix. Now, before I go into detail, I want to hear from you. Comment in the comment section below. Let me know if you have a transmission problem. And if you do, subscribe to my channel. Email me at justcallmeeddie1@gmail.com, and I'll help you out with your project as much as I can. Now, first, it takes a special person to even attempt to take a transmission out, take it apart, and try to fix it. The people have been commenting on my post and emailing me, asking me if they should be able to rebuild a transmission by themselves, and my answer is always the same. If you can read, then you can rebuild. And what I mean by that is there is books out there that will tell you how to rebuild most transmissions, and if you could just follow the instructions and perform them mechanically, you should be able to get your transmission back in working order. Now, these books aren't available for every type of transmission, so first thing you have to do is figure out what type of transmission you have in your vehicle. And there's plenty of websites where you can put your year, make, and model in to do so. Now, these websites will give you a 4 to 6 digit code based on your year, make, and model, and we call that your transmission ID. Now, a transmission ID is going to tell you exactly what transmission you have. It's going to be what you need to order parts and find information on how to rebuild it. Transmission IDs can look very different depending on year, make, and model. And usually on the GMs, you'll have something like a 4L60 or a 4T65E. Now, the next thing you want to look for after you have your transmission ID is if there's parts available for this transmission, because there's nothing worse than having your transmission out of the car apart and finding the problem with it and not being able to get a part to replace it and fix it and put it back together. Luckily, most of the websites you can use to find your transmission ID are parts websites. So as soon as you find your ID, you could scroll through the website, make sure it's got a good list of parts and things available that you can buy for a decent price. Now, what's more important than parts is knowledge, and finding the information on these transmissions can be a little tricky sometimes, and most of the time you have to pay for it. My favorite source for knowledge and information about transmissions is a group called ATSG Automatic Transmission Service Group. They have been making books about these transmissions for years, and they have great information inside these books, and it'll tell you essentially everything you need to do to get your transmission back in working order. The problem with ATSG is they don't have a book for every transmission. So if you go to their website and you can't find a book on the transmission that you have, you're probably going to have to look elsewhere for your information. Don't worry, there's plenty of other service groups out there providing information for all sorts of types of transmissions. You just may have to Google it. Now, the next thing I'm going to go over with you is the tools you're going to need to take apart and put back together most transmissions. Now, to start with, you'll need some basic tools like a metric socket set, a pair of snap ring pliers, a pair of C-clamps. You're going to need a step press or some type of transmission press to compress the springs in the drums to get them apart, and you're probably going to need access to a 2-ton shot press as well for various transmissions. You're also going to need a tool called an H gauge that you're going to use to check your clearance on your transmission when you're done stacking it up, and you'll probably also need some feeler gauges too to check the clearance in your drum. Now, to go more in depth, you're going to need probably some specialty head sockets like Torx head and hex head sockets. You may also need a larger set of sockets to get some of those bigger nuts off those bigger shafts. Now, some transmissions do require specialty tools, so I would do some research and see if you have to use a specialty tool to get your transmission apart. And if you do, you can usually find them online for a reasonable price. And if you can't, you may find somebody on YouTube that's found a way to get it apart without using a special tool. Once you got all your preliminary work done, you know your transmission, you got parts available, you got tools available to take it apart and put it back together. Now it's time to actually practice what we preach. When rebuilding a transmission, you want to make sure you got your bench nice and clear and you have all your parts laid out where you know they go back. And I like to make sure everything is nice, clean, and organized. And that's the most important thing about transmission rebuilding, because the cleaner your unit is when it goes back together, the more chances that you'll have that it actually works properly. Now, stacking your transmission up, I usually stack rear wheel drives up like this. Front wheel drives are a little different because they're oddly shaped at times. So when you're stacking a rear wheel drive transmission, I'm just using a nice base here. You can use a bucket and a flywheel. I've used manual transmissions. They also make kits that bolt to the bench and will hold your transmission up by these little prongs on the side here. whatever you want to do, but as long as it's nice and secure. I got this one ratchet strapped because it's a little odd down here on the bottom. It's not going anywhere. It's nice and secure. I definitely don't want to drop this transmission. Now, when you're looking for problems that go wrong on the transmission, you're looking for burnt clutches like this one. This clutch is obviously got a little hot. And this is caused by lack of lubrication sometimes, or it can be caused by a bad drum not applying enough pressure to the clutch and having it burn up. Good clutches look like this, so you're looking for that. You also look for some of these seals inside the drums. They will break and cause problems like that, or you're looking for any metal broken on any of these things. This transmission didn't have any metal broken on it and didn't really have any metal shavings. It just had these burnt clutches where it was causing it to slip when going into fourth gear. That's the only problem this transmission had. Now, a lot of times you'll get a transmission that has a whole lot of metal in it from some burnt up clutch or some broken piece that's happened in it, and what'll happen is the transmission will stop moving, and it's because this filter right here gets clogged up. And that's another problem you can look for in your transmission. And when you find all that metal, you want to find the source of it. And sometimes the source can be located inside this right here, which is a torque converter. And I have a machine that cuts these open. You probably won't have access to something like that. So you'll just have to assume to replace your torque converter if you find a lot of metal in your transmission. But it's probably a good idea to replace it regardless if you're rebuilding your transmission. Now, when we're talking about the most complex areas of the transmission to rebuild, it's probably going to be your valve body and your pump. This is where the pressure is regulated and sent from to all the clutches. So it has a lot to do with how the transmission shifts and works. And there's valves that go back and forth in here, and they can get stuck or they can get worn and give you all types of shifting issues. We've been through several situations where you just had to replace the valve body and you couldn't get it to act right no matter what you did. Now, during your research, you may find people patch jobbing a transmission, and what I mean by this is people taking apart a transmission, finding one specific problem, and putting it back together without looking for another cause of failure. I'm guilty of this practice as well, as I've found some transmissions with just a broken drum inside of it, replaced the broken drum, put everything else back together, and it worked fine. This is something you don't want to practice often because it leaves a lot of room for error and mistakes. You can miss a lot of things just by not checking them, and then you won't find out until you put it back in the car and you try to drive it and you have a problem and you got to pull the transmission right back out. So usually when I rebuild a transmission, I rebuild the entire transmission. I check every little thing that I can, and if I can't check it, then I usually just replace it. Some people may argue this isn't the most cost-effective way to rebuild a transmission, but I think of time as money. Time that's spent on this car equals dollars spent on the car as well, because it's time that you could be doing something else. And if you rebuild a transmission, put it back in the car, and it doesn't work right away, guess what? That thing has to come right back out, and you have to take it all the way back apart to try to figure out what is going on. And this brings me to my next point about transmission rebuild. You better get good at removing the transmission from the car, because odds are you might have to do it more than once. In a perfect world, you take your transmission apart, you find the problem, you put it back together, you put it back in the car, and it works fine. And this happens most of the time, but there is times where you take a transmission apart, you put it back together exactly how it's supposed to go, you put it in the car, and it has some weird small problem that it didn't have before. And this is where transmission rebuilding gets really aggravating, having to repeat your work over and over and over again until you get it right. I've had to personally take transmissions in and out of a car 4 to 5 times before I had them exactly right. And it's not all bad, because it becomes a learning process where you learn how to do work quickly and you learn where bolts are at on certain cars. If you're not a mechanic and a DIYer, this is probably pointless to learn unless you're working on your own car that you're going to be having for a very, very long time. Then you'll know the insides and outs of your car, and you'll be able to work on it very easily in the future. Now, the last thing I'll leave you with is that these transmissions aren't getting any less complex. They're adding more speeds and more gears to them as the years progress. The car manufacturers are doing this on purpose. They don't want you to take apart these transmissions and try to fix them yourself. They want you to buy a new car or buy a new transmission from the dealer when it finally fails. So what you got to remember is when you're attempting to fix these cars, that you're working against the system, and it's going to be difficult no matter what you do, especially when you're working on something as complicated as the transmission. But you can always remember that you can subscribe to my channel, and I will always be here to help you out with any project you have, big or small. There's multiple ways to reach me, like Facebook, Instagram, and you can email me at justcallme81@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and whatever you do, however you do it, make sure you stay dirty, make sure you work hard, and most importantly, make sure you play hard. And remember, you either get right or you get left. You can just call me Eddie.